On September 11th, this building was transformed into a battlefield. 10 years later, we are a stronger nation. And at the core of that strength is that generation of Americans who have stepped forward to serve in uniform.
What a good man that is. That's Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta. Welcome by the man who had a lot to do with catching bin Laden. Anyway, he was speaking there at the Pentagon right at the 10-year anniversary of the attacks on the Pentagon almost 10 years ago. Well, this morning, Wall Street held a moment of silence to commemorate the victims of 9/11 attacks up there. And joining us right now are two people who had actually a front row seat, you'd have to say, at the moment in history. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Robert J. Darling was in the White House bunker that morning with Vice President Dick Cheney. He wrote about his experience in a book, 24 Hours Inside the President's Bunker. And Richard Keil was the White House correspondent for Bloomberg, and he was traveling with President Bush that morning. He's now a consultant with Purple Strategies. Let me go with Dick first. I want you to tell me about being with I want to get to the Cheney part, but I'm fascinated with what happened in the White House itself. You were with President Bush when he was teaching at that school. Tell me what you thought was the interesting thing that most people don't know about that morning, 9/11.
He had been told by the head of the White House Situation Room, who was on the trip, as we walked in, only that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. Nobody knew anything more than that. But many of us reporters, including myself, were on the phone.
We're looking at it now.
We're on the phone. We didn't have any video, but we were on the phone with our respective desks. And I happened to be talking to one of my editors, Robin Mazzoli, who was narrating in my ear quietly what she was
We're looking at the president's
television.
face there. Boy, did he look young then, by the way. When he's talking to the kids with that school book there, he only knew it was a small plane, right? He didn't know it was part of anything.
He didn't know size or scope. And what I was hearing on my phone from my editor was a narration of the second plane hitting. And he told me later that when he was looking across the room at us, it was like watching a silent horror movie. He could tell from looking at our faces that something very terrible was going on. And it was just moments after that when Andy Card leaned over in that iconic image we have of that day and whispered into his ear.
You know, obviously two planes is a hell of a lot different than one because it shows it wasn't an accident, right?
Absolutely. And he was frozen in the moment. He was doing an event, and he was surrounded by all these young children. And the tension in the room was growing literally by the second.
Let's go to Colonel Darling right now. Colonel, thank you for joining us. You were on duty there at the White House, and you were in the bunker. Tell us about how the vice president assumed the authority, basically, of the chief executive, absent the president, absent the Secretary of Defense, who was busy putting out fires, basically, at the Pentagon at that time.
Yeah, that's right. It's great to be with you, by the way, Chris. And the minute we walked in there, it was about 9:50 that morning. They evacuated the White House at 9:45. I went down into the PIOC, the President's Emergency Ops Center. They told me not to worry about logistics, but to answer the phones, they were ringing off the hook. My first phone call was that we have another hijacked plane 16 miles south of Pittsburgh, inbound Washington, D.C. I turned to my right, and there was the vice president, and I passed the information immediately off to him.
Let's listen to some of that transmission. Let's listen to something from that morning, September 11th. It's a piece of that audio that was made public just this week, one of the 114 recordings from that day just released. It's a conversation, as we were just talking about, between military commanders on the ground and fighter pilots who were up in the air just after 10:30. They're discussing an order given by Vice President Dick Cheney to shoot down civilian planes if needed. Let's listen.
You need to read this. Region Commander has declared that we can shoot down tracks that do not respond to our direction. Okay. I'll pass that to weapons. Okay. The Region Commander has declared that we can shoot down aircraft that do not respond to our direction. So if you're trying to divert somebody and he won't divert, he was saying no. No? Came over the chat. Fox, you got a conflict on that? You got a conflict on that direction?
Right now, no. But
okay. Okay. You read that from the Vice President, right? Vice President has cleared.
Vice President has cleared us to intercept tracks. You know what they do? Shoot them down if they do not respond first on RCC.
Well, Lieutenant Darling, of course, we're all familiar with the Constitution, which gives the President executive authority as Commander-in-Chief, and he designates that through, I believe, statute to the Secretary of Defense. Both that chain of command wasn't effective. How did the Vice President actually? It looks like there was a little conflict in that air conversation in that transmission about the line of authority there. Is that how you read it, or what was going on actually in terms of the right of the vice president under our Constitution to act in that regard?
Sure. I tell you, the minute I gave the vice president information and he ordered right over to the National Military Command Center, a general officer was in the bunker there at the Pentagon. He said, I want 2 F-15s at Otis Air National Guard Base. Let me know when they're airborne. Stand by to shoot that aircraft down. There was no discussion. He seemed to have full control. He seemed to have the authority. He was in full combat mode at that point.
How does that work, though? You know the Constitution. We all know we're sworn to uphold it. The vice president has no executive authority. So how did he get that? Was it derived? Was it given to him, designated to him by the president that morning, or what? How'd that happen? Or was it just something he assumed, given the emergency situation, he would take his risks under the Constitution and do what he thought he had to do as a top political officer in the government?
Sure, it's a great question, but he says, according to his own testimony elsewhere, that he and the president had multiple conversations that morning. At some point, he felt that he had the authority to take that kind of action.
I got you.
From the bunker complex, though, there was no discussion with the president. The minute I gave him that information, he immediately responded back to the Pentagon asking for those fighters. So if he had the authority, he got it before we entered the bunker complex.
Let me go back to you again, Dick. What were you afraid of at the time? And you were with the whole clash of reporters. What were you all thinking? I mean, I was with Phil Griffin, he was the executive producer of this program at the time, and we were trying to figure it out. And we all sort of figured, I think, hey, 2 planes don't cross the Hudson by accident.
No, that's right. And we knew as we were going to the airport from the school, after a very hasty statement from the president, we knew it was an act of terror. Like the president, like Vice President Cheney, nobody knew what was next. The motorcade was very unusual.
How afraid were the people around the president that they would try to get to him? Like the Lincoln assassination, where there's all kinds of pieces of it.
There was a real concern. It was obvious when we got to the airport. Chris, as you know, when you cover the president, you get a security clearance once in the day in the morning. You don't need.
Then you're in the bubble.
Then you're in the bubble, and you only get another one if you leave the bubble. When we got to that aircraft, all these extra Secret Service guys had materialized with bomb-sniffing dogs. We had to go through this again. I was literally running up the back steps of the plane with an agent pushing me, telling me to move faster. The plane was rolling before I got to my seat, and it wasn't a takeoff, Chris. It was a liftoff.
Let me ask you, let's back to you, Colonel, about the decisions of the vice president to recommend the president's itinerary that day, sending him out to Nebraska. What do you make of that? He did get back in time to sleep in the White House that night, which I thought was very important for the country to have the president back home. Tell us what you know about that day in terms of the vice president's direction of the traffic by the president.
Sure. It was about 10:10 that morning. We got the president on the phone. He was on Air Force One. He was airborne. And they put 2 classified programs into effect. The president, on advice, probably from his advisor, said continuity of presidency and continuity of government are now in effect. Essentially, the president, the vice president, and the Speaker of the House can no longer be in the same geographical location, as are the principals from the 3 branches of government. So that put the president out of D.C. for the foreseeable future.
I think all around it was a great show for our country. Thank you all, gentlemen. Thank you very much, Colonel Darling. Thank you, Dick Keil. Good reporting, by the way, by both of you.